Hello again and welcome back to our course on Access 2013 Advanced. In this section we're going to continue to look at VBA in Access 2013 and we're going to create a sub of our own right from scratch, including creating the module that sub will reside in. Now as we go through this section I'm going to tell you a lot more about how to write VBA code, and I'm going to fill in quite a lot of details that I've skipped over so far. First of all, to contain our code we need a module. We can use an existing module, but I'm going to create a new one. There are basically two types of module in Access. You have the class modules at the top and then modules or standard modules down here. Now class modules refer to either a form or a report in Access. You can create your own class modules, but basically when you create a form or a report in Access normally, it will get a class module to hold any VBA code that relates specifically to that form or report. And the most important thing about class modules, as we're going to see later on in the course, is that class modules can also react to events. So they support event handling, something we're going to look at in a few sections' time. Now the content of standard modules is not linked to specific forms or reports, and in theory at least, code in your standard modules is accessible from anywhere within your Access application. Now in fact you can restrict the what's called scope of these modules, as we'll see later on, but let's just say for the moment that they hold general code that's not linked to specific forms or reports. To write a general piece of code I'm going to create a standard module. To create a standard module, if I right click on modules and click on insert and say insert module, note the choice module or class module. I'm just going to insert a module. When I insert the module, by default it gets a name, in this case module 1. These names will count up from 1, and there isn't an option when you create it to choose a name. But with module 1 selected, the properties window down here includes the single property here, the name of the module. I can click in there and change that name, and I'm just going to change it for the moment to test. I usually use a name like test or demo when I'm just trying something out or demonstrating something to somebody else. So just press enter and my module has been renamed to be called test. Now notice how in the code window here the option compare database statement has appeared by default. Now I mentioned the tools options dialog to you before, and if you look on the first tab of that dialog, the second checkbox is unchecked, require variable declaration. I'm going to check that now and click on OK, and I'm going to create temporarily another new module. So I'm going to say insert, and again I'm going to say module. Watch what happens. In this second module I get both of those declarations. I get option compare database and option explicit. Option explicit is the one that requires me to declare my variables. Now I'm going to just put that manually into my test module. If you want to delete a module, I only wanted to demonstrate option explicit to you and that editor option. If I don't need module 1, if you right click, you don't get a delete option, you get a remove module 1. And that in turn brings up a dialog which gives you the option of exporting the module before removing it. If you've got a lot of code and you don't think you need it anymore, you can elect, if you say yes here, it will make a copy of that code to a text file in case you've deleted it in error and you need all or some of the code in it later on. Now of course module 1 I only just created to demonstrate something, so I'm going to say no, I don't want to export module 1, so I'm going to say no to that. And let me just paste into the declarations of my test module that option explicit statement. And generally speaking, by default, I always have those two declarations at the beginning of my modules. So now I can add some code to this module, and I can add the code in the form of either a sub procedure, which generally referred to as a sub in Access 2013 VBA, or as a function. Now there's an important difference between subroutines and functions. It may not mean much to you at the moment, but it will quite soon. And that is that although you can pretty much put the same code in subs as you can in functions, the difference is that a function, when you run it, returns a value. And generally speaking, the way that you use functions in VBA is that when you're doing something in VBA code, then you will call a function to do something and it will return a value to you. The value might be a number or a statement of whether what you were trying to do was successful or not. It might even tell you whether something is displayed or entered. A function returns a value, a sub doesn't. Now for this demo I'm going to create a sub. And for a sub, you actually only need two statements. You need a sub statement that gives the sub a name and an end sub to indicate where the sub ends. So first of all, I'm going to put in this sub statement. So I type sub and a space, and then I type a name for the sub. Subnames are quite restricted. They must begin with an alphabetic character. Generally speaking, you can't include any punctuation characters in them, although there are one or two that you can. You can put an underscore in, for example, and they can't be more than 255 characters long. I recommend that you always use a meaningful name for a sub. It will remind you later on what the sub was intended to do. I'm going to demonstrate an exception to that rule here because this really is just for demo purposes. So I'm going to call this sub demo underscore 1. Then I'm going to press the enter key. Now watch carefully what happens when I press the enter key. What happens is that Access VBA looks at what I've typed. It will actually check under certain circumstances that it's happy with what I've typed, and if it is, it will let me carry on. If it's not happy with what I've typed, then it will give me some kind of error message. The other thing that it's done here is you may have noticed that sub was changed from black to blue, identifying what are called keywords within my code. So it knows that that's a valid statement, sub, and it also rather helpfully put in the end sub statement for me as well, so that I didn't need to type it myself. It's happy with the name demo1, and after demo1 it's added a pair of round brackets. Now these round brackets are there to hold what are called parameters, or sometimes called arguments for this sub. I'll come back to the subject of parameters and arguments later on. Now at the moment that is a perfectly valid legal sub in Access 2013. You saw how to run a sub or a function earlier on. We've got the play button here. Let me run it again. I've just run it. Of course it doesn't actually do anything. It doesn't even display a message. But it is a valid, though not particularly helpful, sub. So it's time to make this sub do something. So I'm going to press enter to leave a blank line. Blank lines and blank spaces in Access VBA are a very good idea. They definitely aid the readability of your code, and indenting things, which is what I'm going to do in a moment, leaving blank lines. Indents, blank lines, they're ignored by Access, so although they'll make it a lot easier to follow what's going on, they're not going to interfere with the functionality of your subs and functions. I tend to work on a principle of progressively indenting lines. So within a sub, the commands, the statements that I'm going to enter to do what I want to do will be indented by one level, and then they may be indented by further levels depending on the sort of statements that I'm using, as you will see later on. In this particular sub, all I'm going to do is display a message. So I press the tab key so that I've got my indent, then I type message box, and as soon as I've typed that command that Access VBA will recognize and press the space, it knows the command I'm trying to execute, which is message box, and it gives me a list of the parameters, or if you like, the arguments of message box, and that will remind me what compulsory things I must type. So that's the bold bit. You must put the prompt in there, and the non-compulsory bits, some of which are in square brackets as you can see, are in non-bold text. So as long as I get a prompt in there, that's fine, but there are various other options that I can add as well. Now we're going to be using message box a bit later on, and we'll look at one or two of those arguments then as well. For the moment, what I want to display is not hello world. I think we've had enough hello worlds. I'm going to say message box 2 star 3. Then I'm going to press the enter key for another blank line. And what do you think that's going to do? Well, let's run it and see what happens. What happens is we get the number 6. So that message box 2 times 3 asterisk is a multiplication symbol. So it rather cleverly multiplied 2 by 3 and got 6, which you may not be particularly impressed by, but it did show you that Access VBA is capable of multiplying two numbers together. Now, one important thing to note here is that all the time that that message box is on the screen, the program is actually still running. It's not actually doing anything actively, but until I've clicked on OK on this message box, the program will not terminate. So let me click on OK. The program terminates, and I'm now back into the Visual Basic editor. You can return to the Visual Basic editor at any point, and you normally can access it from the Database Tools tab. So the next thing I'm going to do is to introduce you to what are called variables in VBA. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to put the insertion point just above the word sub, press the enter key to make a new line, and I'm going to put in a new statement, and this is a dim statement. Now, dim originally was short for dimension. People just think of it as dim now, but it's a statement that's used to declare a variable. And a variable, as the name implies, is something where its value can vary. And we're going to have a variable called a. And I'm going to say dim a, and as soon as I've typed as and press the space bar, I get a list of the types of variables. Now, there are many types of variable in Access. There are dozens, in fact. And the one I'm going to choose on this occasion, and the one that you'll probably use quite a bit, is that one, integer. Double click, it goes into my code. Now what dim a as integer does is to say I have a variable a and it is an integer variable. That means that a can have any integer value. For instance, I could say, let me press enter to leave another blank line, that a equals 6. Now what that statement does is to assign a value to the variable a. A equals 6 means that if I refer to a somewhere in my code, the value of a will be 6. So for instance, in my message box statement, I could replace 2 with a. Message box a times 3. What do you think I would see if I ran that? Well, I hope you're working along with me, and I hope you don't need me to actually try that, but basically the answer to that would be 18, because what happens when Access runs this sub is when you've got something like message box a times 3, what it says is, okay, what's a? Oh, it's 6. 3 is a constant. That's something that doesn't vary. 3 is always 3. So it says message box 6 times 3. 6 times 3 is 18. Okay, I'll put a message box out that says 18. Now, generally speaking, when you're running code in your Access application, you're going to be dealing with variables a lot. I don't mean simple, straightforward variables like a, which is an integer. I mean, you're going to be looking at what somebody's entered onto the screen. You're going to look at somebody's name, or their salary, or the price of something as entered onto a screen, and you're going to be doing calculations and other types of data manipulation based on the values of variables. So variables are a fundamental part of what we do in VBA. So very often we'll be writing code that uses variables rather than constants. Well, let's put in another variable. Why don't we try b equals 4? How about that? And let's change the 3 here to a b. Now what do you think would be displayed if I ran that? And this is a trick question, by the way. Let me just try running it. And in fact, when I run it, I get an error. And the error is a compile error. Now you may look at that and think, well, it looks just the same as the other one. What's wrong with that? And the problem, of course, is that we didn't dim B. We didn't actually say what B was. And that's what option explicit does. It says you must declare your variables. You must say what each of these variables is. If we put in a statement dim B as integer and run that, it would have been absolutely fine. So let's do that. In fact, what I'm going to do, you can either put it as a separate line, or you can actually put it in the same line. Let's try and run that. That's fine. So that's the use of variables in VBA, and we're going to continue looking at many of the other aspects of VBA in the next section. So please join me for that.